And I think that that's really, really key to understand that you and I call it play, but that's their job. That's what they're wired to do. God said, okay, little body, once you get through the birth canal and survive these first couple of months and feel secure and happy and loved and finding a routine, then you're going to learn how to. Hello, and welcome to Talking Toddlers, where I share more than just tips and tricks on how to reduce tantrums or build your toddler's vocabulary. We're going to cover all of that, but here, our goal is to develop clarity, because in this modern world, it's truly overwhelming. This podcast is about empowering moms to know the difference between fact and fiction, to never give up, to tap into everyday activities so your child stays on track. He's not falling behind, he's thriving through your guidance. We know that true learning starts at home, so let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about a secret that really helps support your toddler in cooperating. And you might be surprised, but I thought it was perfect timing with Christmas right around the corner to really dive into this beautiful connection between what I look at as pillars of early development, and that is language and play. And you might be saying, how is that connected to cooperation? Well, these two skills literally grow hand in hand, forming the foundation to your child's ability to communicate overall, problem solve, social emotional abilities, and really integrating and interfacing with the environment. And that's what cooperation is all about. So this will be the first episode of a 3-part series where you and I can explore the distinct types of play, because age is important, right? You're not expecting a 1-year-old to play like a 3-year-old or a 3-year-old to play like a 5-year-old. And it's important to know the differences. And then we'll talk about how they influence language growth. And here I'm all about talking, playing, and eating, and how those 3 pillars meet together to help you guide and raise a beautiful, thriving, happy, curious little guy or little gal. But in this episode and today, we'll start by laying the groundwork, introducing you to categories of play and their connection to early speech and language. And then in the next couple of episodes, depending on how deep of a dive I go, but we'll cover more specific practical strategies and everyday moments that you can nurture these skills at home and make it natural and really help them build their relationship with you, with family, with the environment. And that's where cooperation comes from. So cooperation isn't just being a dutiful little toddler. It's really being a part of your family and a part of his community. And that's what we're looking for. So go ahead, grab your coffee or settle into your walk, or perhaps you're driving, and let's walk through this journey together. So I want to start by someone that I think really helped us as speech language pathologists help other people who work with your children, whether it's parents or preschoolers or other kinds of therapists, really understand this connection between language processing. And I talk a lot about that here, but processing is taking in information or putting information out into the world in a step-by-step sequential process, because that's what speech is. As I'm connecting my thoughts and rattling off sentences, and then those sentences are rattled off by putting a string of words together, and those words are made up of these individual sounds that we have to put in a certain order to make certain words. And so that's the process. Think of it as a computer, but it's much more integrated than just our basic home computer, our laptop or whatever. But this gal, her name is Carol Westby, and she was a speech language pathologist out in the Midwest somewhere. But she really did study and help us understand how play and language and cognition. And so cognition isn't necessarily your IQ score or your intelligence per se, but cognition is how you learn over time, how you think and how you question and how you explore and problem solve and plan and go back to the beginning and reorganize and sequence and all of those kinds of things. But that cognitive skill, your ability to understand and engage in the world, is learned and shaped over time, right? And yes, we are hardwired with certain, DNA and certain inherent skills, right? An artist is an artist and an athlete is an athlete. And so we have this basic raw material, but cognition can be enhanced based on your baby, your toddler, your preschooler's early years. And that's one of the myths that we've kind of exploded, although there's a vast majority of professionals out there that still don't understand and think that quote unquote intelligence, something that I refer to as cognition, is fixed. And that simply isn't true. We know that through neuroscience now and epigenetics and all of this. And I've talked about that in previous episodes and will continue. But it's important to understand how play skills, and we'll have to define what that is, but play and language and cognition really do go hand in hand. So here's a description by Carol Westby. And she states that language and pretend play both require that a child mentally represent reality. Just as the child might realize that a doll is only a representation of a live baby, or that a piece of paper can serve as a doll's blanket, so must she also understand that a word is not the object, but only a representation of the object. And she continues by explaining that language, however, requires more abstraction than symbolic play or pretend play, because unlike play, words do not resemble reality in any clear way, right? The baby doll looks like a baby, right? The shape of a piece of paper could be similar to the shape of a blanket. But words don't resemble reality. And in play, therefore, the symbolizers can be loosely linked together. Like you pick up a block and you pretend it's a phone. So it's similar in shape and size perhaps, but it's loosely linked based on some of the characteristics. But that's not true in speech and language, right? So in the way that play, the symbolizers can be loosely linked together and do not require the structure of what we call the grammatical rule-governed relationship in words. In other words, there are rules to putting certain sounds together for English. There are rules to putting words together in a specific order. There are rules, our grammatical structure of how we communicate, right? Verbally. And you'll see your baby and toddler, they'll start out with whole words like nouns and verbs, and then they'll add endings and prefixes, right? First she'll say, oh, mama cup, and then she'll say mama's cup. She'll put in that possession, but that isn't until around her second birthday. So what's been fun in my career of 35 years of looking at how the brain learns to learn and how we use language to expand that learning. But in the early months, from birth until that first birthday, and then from your first birthday to the second birthday, they're building language. So they're learning as they're building their human ability to communicate, right? And so the way that we as therapists and, moms, even school people, sometimes it depends on their training, but we do recognize that play is the window into what's happening inside their little brains, right? And that if we step back and look at how they're playing, and again, you and I need to define what play is, but we can see how they're thinking and how they're building and understanding and practicing that relationship, whether it's with toys or with objects. Say they're using Tupperware and pretending they're cooking, or say they're in the car seat there and they have an imaginary steering wheel. That's what my daughter used to do, and imagine driving just like mama, because she sits there and watches me. But we can see what they're thinking without even real words, right? So today's episode, we're going to cover several distinct types that can be broken down, and sometimes they can be grouped together loosely, but I'm going to identify, I think there are 8 here, where we look at the different stages because it's important. And I think quite often pediatricians, school-based people, even other therapists jump the gun and don't really understand that there are precursors or earlier steps to learning how to play and learning and building that language load before they come into quote unquote pretend play. They just miss that. And I don't know, perhaps they're just thinking that they wake up on their 2nd birthday or their 3rd birthday and know how to pretend. But there are these precursors that it's important that we all kind of understand. And no matter where your child is in this developmental journey, like I always say, take this information and then watch them from a distance or engage with them, especially during the holidays, and see where they are on their personal journey. And these distinct types, these different categories, will overlap. And so it's not a finite kind of, and on this month, they stop doing this exploratory play and move into functional play. No, they do bleed into one another. So let's look at these first 2 that I mentioned. So the first one is exploratory play, or what a lot of us will now call sensory motor play. And this makes sense because in those first several months, they're really exploring the world. And before they even reach out and explore the rattle that you want them to hold on to, they're exploring their own body, right? They're putting their hands and their feet in their mouth because, one, the mouth gives them the most information because the other sensory parts haven't been developed enough yet. The mouth is still developing, of course, but that's the best channel to gather information. So the first several months is really about exploratory, starting with their own body, and then it really involves manipulating objects to learn about the property of that object. Again, they don't know the difference that this is a toy and this is a piece of food and this is a part of mommy's body and this is a blanket. They're just trying to gather data because they're curious and they're trying to understand. So during this early stage or first stage of sensory motor, they're going to be shaking things and banging and mouthing, like I said, and really trying to figure out, what is this? Is it hard? Is it soft? Is it smushy? Does it have any taste? Does it smell funny? So the important language connection with this exploratory play or sensory motor play phase is really that we encourage them because it supports that cause and effect. And that's one of those cognitive developments, right? That they increase their understanding at the same time that they're increasing their early vocabulary, like, oh, bang, 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 or shake, 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 or drop it, right? So you're putting action words, vocabulary to their movement patterns, as well as they're building that understanding of cause and effect. Oh, if I drop it again, she's going to pick it up. Or if I shake it, it makes a noise. Or if I bang on the table, she's going to imitate me. All of those play-based engagement are helping them understand the language, as well as how do I move my body in space and interact with objects in my immediate vicinity, right? And so this exploratory phase is for infants and very early toddlers. As they approach, say, 10 months and 12 months, a lot of this mouthing of toys and oral motor exploration starts to fade away because they have better skills of moving their body. And we can talk about that later on. But really look at those first 3 months and 6 months and 9 months that a lot of this is happening, this exploratory. They're just figuring out in their immediate environment. And their environment is very small, right? It's you or the little blanket on tummy time, or it's in their crib or under a mobile or whatnot. And so they're not mobile yet. And it's not until they reach that 7th or 8th month where they're really, hopefully, on all fours and starting to move forward or laterally or sometimes backwards as they're crawling. And so their world is expanding and their motor skills are expanding. But language is being wired in their brain as they explore in these first 6 and 8 months. So the next phase, or distinct type, is called functional play. And that's defined by a lot of repetitive actions using the objects as they're intended. So they might roll the ball, or they might continue to stack up the blocks and knock them down and stack them up and knock them down, or take things out of a bucket and dump and dump and dump. They're more into dumping than they are into putting things in the bucket. We have to teach them that. But this functional play is really looking at the objects that they've explored and figuring out their purpose, right? Their function. Now, the language connection is that it's reinforcing their understanding, and you and I are helping them learn the verbs, the function, and the object's names, and putting those two things together. And that's important. And that's why we need to engage with them and interact with them to help map the spoken language with the actions and the objects. And remember, I'm always saying here that if you want your 2-year-old to explode with language and start putting things in short sentences and short phrases, then they need a wide variety of grammatical structures, right? So they need nouns and they need verbs and they need adjectives. And that's what you're building in this functional play. And that's really that early toddler age, right? And think of toddlers as when they start to toddle. More or less, kids at around their first birthday really start standing up and walking and moving forward on their very unstable legs. But that's where that functional play is. They're just getting into everything, right? They're still trying to figure out, oh my gosh, my world just expanded because I can go up on 2 feet and move forward. But at the same time, you have to keep them in a safe environment where they can explore, right? Continue to explore and try out these things. What are these? Oh, this door handle opens and closes, this light switch on and off, right? This little button, it beeps every time I push it. So they're looking to understand how all of these things within their reach works, right? And that's what functional play is. And it's just a lot of repetition, and it drives you crazy, but it's building their understanding. It's building their language, their network, and it's putting ideas together, and they're exploring and they're curious. And we don't want to stunt that, right? And so keep that in mind in this first 12 months and 24 months, especially as I mentioned, it's the holiday season, and they really just need simple things to explore, like Tupperware and pots and pans and simple little tools to dig in the dirt and those kinds of very real life function kinds of things. And so think of that as you're moving forward in the holiday season, right? So number 3 would be constructive play. And that is really the older toddlers. So I'd say 2.5 all the way through preschoolers. And just like it sounds, it's much more constructive. And so this type of play is described as creating or building something. That's when they're interested in puzzles or building towers with a purpose, right? Or putting animals or little small people in vehicles or the barn or those kinds of things that are much more constructive. And they like to also do things like the farm set or like I said, the little people or a bus or an airplane or a dolly in a baby carriage or those kinds of things that often will reflect what they are seeing in their environment. Now, the language connection in this type of constructive play really begins to introduce them to spatial awareness and descriptive vocabulary. So you can talk about the size and the shape. Prior to that, you're building nouns and verbs, right? And then it's really a lot more sit next to or put the box under the table. So a lot more of this 3-dimensional play as they're really putting things together and creating things, whether it's outside and just making a big pile of leaves and jumping in it or a snowman or those kinds of things. But this constructive play, they're really honing in on their motor development, right? So a brand new 2-year-old is still a little uneasy with climbing on things or his fine motor skills with building things. But even a 2.5, 6 months later, is much more developed and much more capable. And so their interests are going to expand. And you're building that language connection based on what they're doing, based on what their play is. And I think that that's really, really key, is to understand that you and I define it or call it play, but that's their job. That's what they're wired to do. God said, okay, little body, once you get through the birth canal and survive these first couple of months and feel secure and happy and loved and finding a routine, then you're going to learn how to become a family member and a little person in your small community step by step. It's a process, right? And you're going to do it in activities, i.e. play, that are fun, that reflect real life, that you feel like, oh, mama's stirring in this pot, I can stir in the pot too. Or I see men out there, with big machinery and they're climbing up ladders. Well, I have a truck here too. I have a big machine. They're really looking out in the environment and starting to practice what they see, what they hear, what people are encouraging them to do. So that's how language is built, by exploring and feeling and touching. You're giving them the language with what they're doing, right? Whether they're crawling or learning to walk or crawl up a ladder or learning how to do a teeter-totter or a swing, those kinds of things, building puzzles. And you're engaged with them and talking with them and helping them understand that language connection. At the same time, they're expanding their curiosity, expanding, oh, I didn't get that puzzle right. Let me try it again. Or, oh gosh, I can put 3 of these blocks together, but the 4th one topples everything over. Now, they're not thinking about it consciously like you and I would sit down to do a math problem. They're thinking about it through experience. And that's what that experiential learning means, that they need to experience and they need to fail. And we learn best by our mistakes. If we keep doing something and always getting it right, then 1, we get bored, and 2, it doesn't expand our skill set. And so keep that in mind as you're looking at, once again at different toys or different activities to do with your little ones, that we want to always be pushing that envelope. And that's that 80-20 rule that can be used here, right? That 80% is going to be repetitive. And then you have to stretch the horizon a little bit 20% of the time. So the next play level number 4 would be pretend play or symbolic play. And that is quite often where everybody jumps to. And that really is the preschool level. And I think we as a society, culture, do our kids a disservice because we're expecting 2-year-olds to do a lot of this pretend play, and they're just not ready yet. They're doing a lot of parallel play at 2. And it's really that preschool age, closer to 3.5 and 4, or 3, I'd say even an early 3, 3.5 and 4, where they're really doing that pretend play. And that is defined as involving imagination, as you're probably very aware of, and role playing. And so you have to have enough sophisticated language. You also have to have enough of social maturity. And so a 2-year-old is still very egocentric. They're still really looking into themselves, and that you, mama and daddy and grandma and big brother or something, you're just there to help me get what I want. But at 3, their language and their understanding of relationships have expanded. And their memory and ability, that frontal lobe, is really starting to take some shape where you can help them understand, okay, 2 more turns, and then we have to put it away and get ready for bed. It really does help with narrative skills, enriches the vocabulary on all levels, and that they're beginning to really understand social roles, as well as their ability to express some abstract ideas. And it's interesting to watch, like in the early pretend play, they really will just model things that they see in the immediate environment. Like I said, cooking or digging or taking care of the baby. And then as they really reach that 4-year-old at 3.5 to 4 and closer to what I call the true preschooler, is that then they'll be able to imagine and taking on roles through something that they've already experienced, but not in the immediate context. So for example, that's where they might pretend to be a doctor, or pretend to be a fireman, or pretend to be a teacher, because they've been in those situations, or they've seen a fireman, maybe they visited the fire station, or, of course, they've gone to the doctor's office. And so they can play those roles, and it's not, I'm not in the kitchen pretending to cook beside my mama, or putting the baby to bed like I've done 1,000 times with my own parents, right? That they really do have more abstract, and then they can fantasize too, closer to that 4th and 5th birthday. And they really then pretend to be a superhero, or pretend to be a fairy, or pretend to be a deep sea diver, or whatever. And then they become fantastic, right? Their abstract ideas expand. And that's really huge between that 3rd birthday and then that 5th birthday. But these preschoolers really are much more social and much more capable of navigating these social situations. And again, I think we often expect our 2-year-old or our young 3-year-old to be able to do that. And they just don't have the maturity, right? The social maturity, but they also don't have the language and the understanding to navigate that successfully. And of course, you put them in those situations, but you support that. You help them take turns. You help them share. Johnny wants to be the fireman. You're going to be the bus driver or whatever the role playing is, right? And so you can take turns after that. So you will often have to help them navigate that if they're a new 3-year-old. Now, number 5 in these play stages is that social play, and I touched upon that, but it's defined as involving a lot more other people, hence the name, right? Social, and including more cooperative games and group activities. So again, this is a little bit different. There might be rules involved, say this T-ball, or you're playing kickball, or even go fish or Uno if you're teaching them board games. That it's really important to help them understand that this is an opportunity to spend time with other people, right? And to play. And that it's not about winning and losing, but more importantly, it really is about having fun. And that's the true definition. And I know I've talked before about Stuart Brown's work about how he defines play. And that's a whole nother, podcast episode, but it's really true play can look like work to somebody else, right? Like I really like researching and writing. And so I could look at that as play, right? Or somebody who likes to build a house could look at that as play, where somebody else says, oh my gosh, that's heavy labor and that's hard work, right? But what we want to do through this stage of social play is to help them enjoy the process, right? To learn how to be part of a team, or to follow the rules and understand that it's just for fun. The language connection in social play really does promote that conversational turn taking and being able to negotiate. Think about on the playground, right? To take turns, whether it's on the teeter-totter or t-ball, like I said, those kinds of games where you have to negotiate and understand your role. And also, it builds on understanding social cues like facial expressions and tone of voice. And so you can think about that with big group activities like t-ball or something. Or you can think about it if you're sitting at the table and playing a board game. It's important to help them. For example, like if someone picks up a card and they smile, then you say, oh, I see that smile. That must be you got something you wanted. It matches in goldfish or something. So you help them understand facial expressions and tone of voice. But it's a very subtle and yet dynamic, if those two words can coexist in the same process, but it really does enrich their social skills, their language understanding through this play action. So now the next level would be physical play. And you might be saying to yourself, oh, isn't this all physical play? Yes, but again, when we relate these play stages or steps in with language, it's important to look at play requires us to do something, right? So physical play, level 6, really requires a lot of gross motor. And like I said in the very beginning, a lot of these things overlap, right? So with social play, if you're learning how to play t-ball or whatever social game you're playing, there is a physical aspect to it, of course. But these requiring the gross motor, like running and jumping and climbing and that kind of thing, even tag, helps us understand and learn through the actions, right? And so the language connection with this really helps kids understand action-oriented vocabulary. Like, oh, you almost touched him when you're, playing tag, right? Oh, I got so close. And it fosters encouragement and it fosters a shared activity like, oh, just run a little faster and you'll get to first base, right? And it's expanding their language, expanding their social communication, and you're learning it in real time. And that's the key, I think, when we look at social play and physical play, that they're really learning that process in real time. And that's important because that solidifies it in our brains. And then tomorrow when we go to play it again, then we'll have kind of problem solved it when we sleep at night. And you're like, oh yeah, I know, if I just run a little bit faster, whatever the activity is. But the whole idea is, oh, I know what this feels like in my body to push up on the teeter-totter or to play duck, duck, goose or musical chairs or those kinds of things where I've experienced it both in my body and in my mind, and I've kind of colored it with language. And so now I'm going to be a little bit better today or next week or next month, right? And so it's important to understand social and physical play do go hand in hand, and it crosses a lot of ages, right? Of course, we start at 2, right? You play a little tag, you play matching games. So you start to introduce these things at 2. They have richer language at 3. They still need a lot of support because they don't have that social emotional maturity yet. So they can't play these games on their own, but with support they can. And then by that 4th birthday and that 5th birthday, they're a lot more independent with it, right? And we have to adapt these social experiences based on their developmental understanding and social emotional readiness. And then I've already talked about this a little bit, but it has a different category, and it's that fantasy play, right? Because we talked about pretend play, and a lot of that will model what we do in real life. And then the fantasy is really defined as how it expands beyond real life scenarios, including make-believe worlds and make-believe characters. And that's really fun to watch. And that's really not until they're closer to 5 and 6. It's predominantly that preschool and those early elementary years. But then it can be carried on, of course, because fantasy is, oh, yes, I want to play in the school play, or you take on roles for early debate or those kinds of things. So it can certainly, the language that's connected to this fantasy play really develops advanced storytelling, right? And creative language and imagination. Maybe there's someone who really reads a lot of fantasy books. That was my daughter. And so she had a lot of imagination in her own head. But it also really supports problem solving and being able to use language to negotiate, to convince other people to do certain things. And it's really fascinating to watch kids who have kind of a rich fantasy life, that they do tell pretty great stories, and they do tend to be better communicators in a social level. But it's predominantly preschoolers. And as I said, it can carry out these, become the directors of the play, or people who write books, or can also build things, build houses and structures, and imagine something in this property, or imagine building a new software, or those kinds of things. And so those individuals can take it to the next level, but it starts very, very young, right? And again, like I've said before, we have our different temperaments, we have our different styles. We just want to give every child the opportunity to go through these stages. And, some kids are like, I'm not going to do that fantasy play. I want to go ride my bike and be more pragmatic and grounded. That's okay. But you want to perhaps imagine through storytelling, or imagine not necessarily screen time, because that gives them that visual and they don't imagine themselves. So you want to give them a lot of opportunities when you read more riching storybooks when they're a little bit older, right? But I think you see beyond that 3-year-old here. I try to focus, but you're building up to that 6-year-old and 7-year-old and beyond with these kinds of play base, because you do introduce it when they're 2 and 3 and 4. And so it might not be part of their natural human nature, but you want, again, to give them that opportunity. And then the 8th one, really looking at play, is game-based. And again, we start it when they're young, by taking turns, by spinning the die, by asking, do you have an elephant in Go Fish, or those kinds of things. But the game-based really is defined as a structured activity with rules. Like I said, with board games or simple card games. And it's all about following the rules and taking turns. And that's very hard for a 3-year-old. So don't set yourself up. It doesn't mean that you don't go there. It just means that play in teams, or give him or her a lot of support. And the language that's connected with all of this is to build an understanding of the rules. Oh, mommy just went. She took her turn. Who is next? So to understand how you take your turns around the table. Or I have an elephant and you have an elephant. Are they the same? And they go together. So they match. And so if you're playing Go Fish. And so the strategy behind this board game or the simple card game, the social communication, it is competition, but it's a healthy competition, right? It could also be a team. Oh, it's me, mommy, and Tommy, and it's daddy and Susie, and we're a team, right? We're going to play against each other. And so there's a lot of rich language understanding of how things are broken down if it's a formal activity. Just like in the kitchen. Oh, before we put in the milk, if we're making a cake or something, we have to beat the eggs, right? So there are steps involved. And so this is where that language connection, what do you do first? What do you do next? And so the game-based, again, you start very young, closer to that 3rd birthday is typical. And then you just move beyond from preschoolers and beyond. Again, thinking of the holidays, thinking of games, thinking of presents that you might be interested. Think about how these different distinct types really can help you make your selection, and not to overdo it. A lot of times is keeping it simple, right? So the first one was exploratory play. So if you have a baby or an infant, and I think you already know this, they're just going to explore, but they don't need a lot of different things. They actually need time with you more than newer and newer and newer things. So a handful of toys that are safe to put in their mouth, and a lot of tummy time and a lot of time with you, mama and daddy and grandparents, right? Number 2 is that functional play that they're really just trying to figure out what the heck this thing does. Oh, the ball rolls, but the block doesn't, right? And then there's constructive play where they are beginning to put things together like simple puzzles, and Then the pretend play, where it's really a symbol that represents something. They're pretending to put the baby to bed. They're pretending to drive the car. They're pretending to dig a ditch. But then that really starts to bleed into more social play. And it's around that third birthday where they're really interested and able to play with others. And there's more cooperation. And this title is all about cooperation. And you can see how these play skills really help build that understanding, because in the very beginning, of course, it's all about me, right? That's what an infant is all about, and an early toddler, right? That 1-year-old, and exploring, what can I do? What can I feel? What can I learn today? Right? And then they slowly, in time, engage with you, engage with other kids, and then expand upon that. Pretend play, and then social play, and physical play, and fantasy play, and then game-based play, right? And so keep that in mind. And for these next couple of episodes, I will continue and look more closely at how play skills and language go hand in hand, and how I, as a therapist, like these last couple of weeks, I've been meeting with new moms, and the kids aren't very chatty with strangers, but I've been able to understand where the little children are, the 2-year-old and the almost 3-year-old, by how they play and how they respond in a play-based setting, right? We just had toys on the floor, but I could really see how they're curious and how they understand how little puzzle pieces went together, or how they were able to use gestures based on their quote unquote play. And so I could understand that, they're understanding everything. They follow directions well. They know how to wait their turn, and all of these kinds of cognitive and language-based skills, but they're just not really chatty Cathys outside of their comfort at home, right? And so that can be very common. And so, one of the most important thing is to rule things out. All of the other elements of language are developing, but their articulation, their speech production, that physical part of talking isn't as developed as we would like. And so we really do, we as therapists, and hopefully, school-based people understand that connection, that play and language are really symbiotic, right? And symbiotic means that they are two different things, but go together. So we also understand that if there are delays in play, and in future episodes, I'll talk about what that looks like, but if there are delays in their play ability, then we can most likely suspect that there are delays in language, right? So just kind of keep that in mind, that before your child is able to use language, they must be able to represent reality with other symbols. And that's what play is, right? Because like I said in the very beginning, words are symbols. They represent, apple, okay? That I can pretend to hold this, round red ball, and I can pretend that that's an apple in my play. And then the symbol for it in words is apple. It's not banana. It could be fruit, but it's more specific if I say apple, right? And so those words are symbols, just like a demonstration, like if I'm going to swing a golf club or shoot a basket, that's a gesture or a symbol that represents, I want to go to the park and play basketball. The important part is that we see toddlers first learn to use symbols and representation in play before, or in real life, it's almost simultaneous, right? That around that second birthday where they're really putting more words together, their play begins to expand. When we want kids to put 2 and 3 words together, to be able to say, mommy coat off, right? Like mommy's coming home and she's taking her coat off and she's going to stay here for the evening. That will develop or really explode as their imaginative play, where they can put the coat on and they put the hat on and they pretend they're going to work, right? So they're demonstrating it through their physical activity, i.e. play, and then they begin to be able to say it symbolically through their words. There's been so much excellent study in the last 30 to 50 years connecting play and language and cognition development over time. And I just want to emphasize to new moms that helping them learn these stages through experience with you at home, keeping it simple in those first 3-4 years, even 5 years, right? They don't need a lot of stuff for Christmas. They need some basic tools, right? Or toys or whatnot, but they really want to have that experience with you. And keep that in mind as you go forth. We'll continue the conversations and diving in how you can best support your child, no matter where they are on this journey. I'll give examples and more specific ages and types of simple toys, activities, game play-based learning experiences that doesn't have to break the bank and doesn't really require a lot of gadgets. So keep it simple, have fun with your little one, talk, sing, sing, sing. It's Christmas time, so do a lot of Christmas caroling. I appreciate your time, your precious time. I know that you have a lot of things on your plate, but keep it simple, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Take care. Bye.